few words to say.
We're surprised.
It's both a humbling and exhilarating feeling to look out at this gathering here tonight, filled with so many people with such stunning accomplishments and honors, alongside family members close at hand and friends who've flown in from afar. And to realize that you're all here to share a celebration of the doings that fate and fortune have somehow, some way, enabled me to return in kind to the communities both on this campus and off, that birthed and molded and sustained me before and across the 6 decades since I first walked onto these ancient but transfigured Dakota lands as a wide-eyed, then slim 16-year-old freshman in the fall of 1963. Occasions like this are only possible through the streaming together of many people's generously focused energies, conscientiousness, and care. So without bombarding you, the long and worthy list of individual names, you will hear some. Let me offer my deepest appreciation to all those whose labor and devotion have brought this evening about. To the initiators, nominators, and letter writers from my home department in African American and African Studies, Karen Ho, Vanessa Steele, Rose Brewer, Yuishi Onishi, Tadio Kedeji, and company. And in the CLA Dean's office with Ann Waltner and her staff. And in CLA's Office of Institutional Development with Lewis Clark and Clayton Smith, as well as in my long-standing second home in English. To the All University Honors Committee and the offices of Interim President Jeffrey Ettinger and now President Rebecca Cunningham, who forwarded the necessary recommendations to the Board of Regents. To Regent Emeritus Abdul Amari and the Board of Regents itself, with whom I have had alternative occasions for interchange. In the distant and not so distant past. To the heavy lifting planning efforts of Megan Mail and my own in-house event planner extraordinaire, my life partner and wife, Serena Wright.
So sweet.
And to each of the presenters ahead of me tonight, including President Bob Brunix, Roxanne Gibbons, and Waltner, who've delivered such enticing testimonials on my behalf. When Megan first contacted me and Serena about coordinating these proceedings, she informed me that the options traditionally offered OAA recipients included the potential presentation by me of a lecture on a pertinent topic of my choosing, an option that, to save both you and me the dangers of such doings, I immediately declined. I did not decline, however, this opportunity to share a little more briefly than in a full lecture, at least some personal testimony and rumination about the zigzagging trajectories that have catapulted me across alumni space and time. I do so because that wide-eyed 16-year-old freshman and alumnus yet to be that I constituted in 1963 was, as I have ultimately come to understand, both all accident and no accident at all. Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison, who Serena and I were privileged to spend some quiet time with during her visit to this campus back in 1996, had years earlier supplied her readers with two ideas that have helped me put my ruminations about life journeys in context. The first is what she calls not remembrance, but rememory. Recollections, that is, of obscured and sometimes repressed events from one's personal past that create a haunting, uncanny sensation of both familiarity and strangeness. The second idea is what she calls rootedness, the ancestor as foundation, which to her meant comprehending our imaginative and expressive lives in terms of how we address the conscious and or felt presence of those ancestors in our lives. Our elders, she believed, potentially possess symbolic and gyroscopic weight. They are not just biological parents or grandparents, aunts or uncles. They are varieties of timeless beings whose relationships to us can potentially be benevolent, instructive, protective, if we pay attention. They can provide certain otherwise unavailable forms of hard-won, irreducible wisdom, and they need not be connected to us genealogically. But to keep these ruminations from veering off into lecture, let me get back to my 16-year-old non-accidental self. Just 3 weeks before I first set foot on this campus in late August of that year, the famous March on Washington, which was the 1960s revival of A. Philip Randolph's 1943 original planned but unactualized protest mobilization during World War II. This resurrected new march had culminated on the Great Mall in this nation's capital. Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered his momentous "I Have a Dream" oration. And University of Minnesota journalism alum and NAACP leader Roy Wilkins had announced from the same podium that 93-year-old William Edward Burghardt Du Bois had just died in self-imposed exile as a guest of Kwame Nkrumah's recently independent Ghana. As transfixing as that event was for adolescent me and so many others, I was in no way aware at the time that those twinned occurrences and twinned non-biological elders served as a kind of symbolic preamble to what lay ahead for me on this campus, first as an undergraduate and then a graduate student, and ultimately as a longtime faculty member. To press the non-accidental perspective, my 1963 arrival on campus was argumentably a transgenerational accomplishment, rooted in specific ancestral foundations and family naming traditions that honored respected elders and projected their presences into the family's possible futures. I and my other siblings were named for such elders, and those names reverberated almost ritually in the fragments of family history and contingency that surfaced sometimes reverently, sometimes comically, in the tales, jokes, and riffs that marked our family gatherings. I was named for my paternal grandfather, John Samuel Wright I, the Kentucky-born only son of one of the longest-serving 9th Cavalry Buffalo soldiers. The family tales told about Granddad Drap, his nickname, centered on the epic journey, alone at age 10 in the 1880s, following his mother's death in Kentucky, that he made initially by railroad west out of Louisville, then by stagecoach from St. Louis, Missouri, and finally by Indian ponies, the rest of the way from Flagstaff, Arizona, to rejoin his repeatedly redeployed father, then stationed at the 9th Cavalry's regimental home in Fort Duchesne, Utah. Young John Wright would graduate from high school there at Fort Duchesne, then sojourn back to Kentucky to enroll as his unschooled but aspirational father wished in a college at a small, newly founded Baptist freedmen's school called Eckstein Norton University, from which, after graduating at age 18, he married 17-year-old Fannie Hall and became a country school teacher for black children before public education for those children existed. But economic recession, Southern crop failures, and deteriorating race relations in post-Reconstruction Kentucky led Drapp and Fannie in 1895 to join the accelerating black refugee exodus northward and to follow Fannie's father, Barbara George Hall, way out west of Minnesota, as she would put it, where George had landed earlier in the 1870s and had found what appeared to be a beachhead of opportunity. Through luck and pluck, Fannie would also say, she and John made a way out of no way and devoted themselves to achieving prosperity for a family that grew rapidly to 7 offspring, as they devoted themselves simultaneously to raising the race. Well, the phrase familiar to those of you who know Du Bois's work and outlook, to raising the race through a variety of community and self-help organizations. So, what does all this backstory have to do with the non-accidental me and the University Alumni Award we're here to acknowledge? To answer, my grandfather had quickly joined the recently founded Bethesda Baptist Church, Black Minneapolis' oldest, in the Elliott Park neighborhood not far from here, where he promptly became the director of its educational programs. In that capacity, he orchestrated in 1901 what appears to be the first recorded public conclave between the church's community membership and the small contingent of black law students then matriculating at this university campus under Cyrus Northrup's presidency. The church conclave's purpose to debate forthrightly the pressing political issues generated by the expansion of Jim Crow policies across the country following the separate but equal Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision 5 years earlier. The next year, in 1902, as a member alongside lawyer Frederick McGee in the National Afro-American Council, the pioneering predecessor to the NAACP, he helped shepherd that organization's biannual conference, which had been brought to St. Paul, wherein he met and mingled with Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, T. Thomas Fortune, and a host of other national black leaders at the Grand Ball, which took place here on campus in the Armory Building. On grandmother Fannie's own independent part, and she was very independent, she participated some years later in the Women's Auxiliary of A. Philip Randolph's rising Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, as well as in a dizzying array of black women's social groups. She founded and presided over what she titled the Pioneer Colored Women's Economic Development Club. And with North Minneapolis Phyllis Wheatley House's dynamic leader, Gertrude Brown, she helped lay the groundwork for the collaborations with this university's Northrop Convocation programs that from the late 1920s onward would bring national black artistic and intellectual leaders like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, James Weldon Johnson, and Richard Wright to this campus. Between them, in other words, John and Fannie Wright helped give this institution's federal land grant mission operational significance for Black Minnesotans and our allies across the local spectrum.
Yeah.
And at the height of the Great Depression in 1934, in defiance then of President Lotus Kaufman's now well-documented Jim Crow campus regime, they sent their two youngest children, my father Boyd and his younger sister Martha, to this university to enter, in my father's case, its School of Mortuary Science, and in my aunt's case, the School of Technology. 2 years later, in 1936, they became part of the tiny group of Black students then on campus who established the groundbreaking Council of Negro Students to bring communion and commitment to their campus lives. Martha became the very visible president of the council and its subsequent challenges to Kaufman's regime, as well as the leader of the U's Black Sorority AKA chapter at a time when the AKA sisters took special pride in having the highest GPA of any fraternal or sororal group on campus, bar none. As for my father, his visible presence on campus, for me, in Morrisonian rememory, crystallized early in my own developing consciousness, before I turned 16, through the medium of a family picture album that contained a riveting black and white photograph of him reclining sideways, propped up model-like on one elbow, head canted nonchalantly off-angle atop the grass of the Northrop Mall in a full-length wool top coat and black banded white fedora, exuding the Vanity Fair elegance and confident composure of a deserving but unanointed campus lord. The aura of imperturbable belonging in that photo gave me a wordless but powerful source of pride and fortitude as I succeeded him and my aunt a generation later into what in my 16-year-old world had become the Institute of Technology, renamed again today as the College of Science and Engineering. My generation would reimagine campus communion and commitment in the form of our era's MLK-inspired Students for Racial Progress, STRAP is the acronym we used, or our subsequent Black Liberation minted Afro-American Action Committee, whose occupation in January of 1969 in Morrill Hall, after the wrenching assassination of Martin King in spring '68, still seems to reverberate, aptly or otherwise, in student minds and movements on this campus up to this very moment. Because so much of the continuing commentary on the takeover has focused through the years on the politics and ethics of civil disobedience and disruption, I want to direct our attention for a moment to an understudied facet of that whole process, to the intellectual and experiential void on this campus and others like it, that the demand for informal creation of the academic department of African American and African Studies could only partially address. The deep hunger we felt as young Black folk for a sense of wholeness and rootedness and intellectual vitality was beyond the capacity of this or perhaps any conventional academy such as this to provide at the time. So we turned reflexively, intuitively, to local community elders for that kind of sustenance. More than anyone else we came to know, Mahmoud El-Khati, based then at the Way Community Center on the Minneapolis North Side, modeled what we so desperately needed. A transplant from the Deep South with a history degree from Wilberforce University, that 19th century abolitionist mainstay, and an ex-slave grandmother who's lived wisdom to guide him. That small-bodied, large-souled Milt Williams, soon to rename himself as a famed 16th century African Muslim scholar of Timbuktu, had landed here in Minnesota with a seemingly bottomless reservoir of historical acumen, a photographic memory, layered with resonating quotations from every ancient and modern source imaginable. The analytical tools of a philosopher dialectician on the one hand, and those of an empirical psychologist on the other. Unawed by the pedantry and pigeonhole myopia reverenced by so many professional academics, he had a supple street corner skepticism about experientially unmoored theorizing and pseudoscientific race thinking. He could talk rings around hidebound, sheepskin-toting classroom professors, and had a fervent, undying love for Black people and a keen appreciation for the unending marvels and terrors of the human condition. He kept one foot always in the nexus of community organizations and issues, and as one of the founding faculty members of the department, he, more than anyone else, with the possible exception of his soulmate department colleague, Josie Johnson, symbolized the bridging possibility of a communiversity that was brighter to our inner eyes than Jay Gatsby's green light could ever be. His devotion to elders of the kind that Toni Morrison valorized, grandmothers and mothers especially, provided a healthy corrective to those young men of my generation in need of antidotes for our own misaligned attitudes and behaviors. Turning appropriately, therefore, to my own mother, Mae Franklin Roach Wright, daughter of pre-World War I immigrants from Barbados and the British West Indies. To her, I owed the gift of pre-kindergarten literacy that has permeated my life ever after. She taught me to read by the time I was 4. And to her, I owe resonant accounts of her hard-scrabble Boston childhood and of her foster brother, my Uncle Charles Quick, for whom one of my younger brothers is named, a brilliant law student who had eventually roomed together off campus with historian John Hope Franklin during their graduate schools together at residentially segregated Harvard, the same as here in the 1930s. After graduating from Harvard with honors in 1938, Uncle Charles headed south to help develop an HBCU law school at North Carolina College, and from there had been recruited by legendary civil rights law crusader Charles Hamilton Houston to help turn the Howard University Law School into the litigation engine of the civil rights movement and its NAACP legal defense agenda in the 1940s and 50s. Uncle Charles would run the moot courts at Howard Law School, where the crusading barristers practiced their presentations in advance of official sessions before the U.S. Supreme Court justices. And he served as the evidence specialist for the legendary team of lawyers that Houston's protege and Uncle Charles's ally and friend, Thurgood Marshall, assembled to fight and win such major court battles as the 1950 Sweat versus Painter case against institutional segregation at the University of Texas, which was a prelude to the historic 1954 Brown versus Board education case in which Uncle Charles had likewise advanced the plaintiff's cause and helped send Plessy Ferguson to its waiting grave. In my mother's quiet voice, Charles Quick's and John Hope Franklin's names were both golden in our household, and precisely the kind of gyroscopic guides for me that Toni Morrison proclaimed. So, to move these looping ruminations on ancestral foundations and rememory toward a proper close, let me acknowledge that I've given you more backstory preamble than a gloss on my later years as graduate student and faculty member. The bio in your program provides a skeleton outline of that later storyline. The presenters you have already heard have put some flesh on those bones. And this room is full of people that I've been blessed, so blessed to work with over the years on so many fronts, and who know very well their contributions to those listed accomplishments that belong as much to them as to me. In retrospect, as an undergraduate and graduate student traipsing across 3 different fields in different colleges, I've had the lasting benefit of a rich array of wonderful professors, some of whom would later become colleagues and lasting friends, across the physical and social sciences, the humanities, history, and the visual and performing arts. The graduate programs I was part of in the English department and American Studies gave me both disciplinary rigor and multidisciplinary license. Tony McNairn calmly rechanneled my energies when I sarcastically assaulted a William Wordsworth sonnet in her course on Romanticism. The legendary English department baron, Samuel Holt Monk, did his best to recruit me into his cohort of 18th century graduate student specialists after I outshined the leader of that cohort in an essay on Jonathan Swift. Chester Anderson, scholar of the Irish Renaissance and the first to mount an English department course on Black literature, lured me into taking over several sessions of that course and into taking my first steps into the professorial ranks. In our American Studies program, one of the country's earliest and most distinguished, despite its unreconstructed Anglophilia, Mary Turpey deftly challenged us doctoral students to go toe-to-toe with our counterparts in single discipline fields. Mulford Sibley made American political history an engrossing exploratory sleigh ride. Rudolph Vicoli's seminars on U.S. immigration history addressed the issues of American cultural pluralism, where the rubber meets the road. Alan Spear's packed courses on African American history whetted our appetites for more. And David Noble's costumed lectures on American intellectual history gave me an irresistible inkling of what ultimately would become my chosen briar patch. The greatest intellectual adventure for me, however, came to the creation of the History of African Peoples doctoral program in the early 1970s, one of the country's very first enterprises in cross-cultural and comparative studies of the global African diaspora. As one of the unanticipated collateral advantages facilitated by the founding of the Department of African American and African Studies, it united a group of distinguished multidisciplinary and history department faculty with a corollary group of a full dozen Black graduate students, some of whom, like Earl Lewis, Joe Trotter, Quintard Taylor, have become deservedly famous. All hungry, as I was, for Africa-centered theoretical frameworks and activist-oriented field research at home and abroad, amidst the era's worldwide movements for decolonization and human rights. Although it had no institutional funding for graduate fellowships, we all had to generate our own financial support by whatever means necessary. The African People program sparkled with an intellectual energy that for me and almost all the others was transformational. several of the contributing faculty in that program. Lansene Kaba, the Black Prince, we affectionately call him.
Yes, we do.
Alan Isaacman, who's here among us. August Nimps had also been teaching special demand seminars and workshops at Carleton College in Northfield about international liberation movements and the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa. So the transformative impact of the African Peoples Program became literally transformative for me. And the black students at Carleton in turn clamored for a Black Studies program of their own. Professor Kaba pointed Carleton's dean in my direction as a young scholar well equipped to take on that task. As a prescribed institutional outcome of the Moral Hall takeover, I had been working as director of the MLK program in CLA while finishing my doctoral coursework in prelims and had wearied of battling the college and central administration over the funding properly needed for MLK program undergraduate student counseling and advising services. A change of venue seemed in order for me. And the challenge of inaugurating a second Black Studies enterprise, this time in a small elite liberal arts college, was intriguing. So I packed up, moved to Northfield, and spent a decade there earning tenure and building a program from the ground up. Paul Wellstone, as a collaborator, he was in a similar situation, trying to create an urban studies program there at the time. We collaborated routinely in the process. Until two of my favorite African Peoples Program professor colleagues, Lansene Kaba once more, alongside the erudite and dapper Russell Hamilton, resurfaced to invite me out to lunch with the seductive purpose of luring me back to the university campus. To be even briefer, Lansene and Russell succeeded. And in 1984, I returned to the department that I had had a hand in originating 15 years earlier. And under repeated pleas from then CLA Dean Fred Lukerman, I agreed to share the department. Bob Brunings has recited some of this enterprise and this process, but with the express condition that the college would promise to support my efforts to acquire a research-worthy archive of African Americana, akin to those I had been frequenting around the country during my decade at Carleton, the kind of research archive which this university had never possessed. Fred's promise bore fruit when a student protege I had strategically found an internship for in Wilson Library Special Collections alerted me that one of the largest private archives of Black literary culture in the country had come up for auction. I then enjoined Fred to accompany me to President Ken Keller's quarters and to make the case for acquiring it. Happily, President Keller needed no strong-arm tactics to agree. And he generously and courageously loaned the $150,000 of discretionary funds, presidential discretionary funds, for the Library Special Collections Division to acquire in 1985, again, what I initially simply called the Black Studies Collection. But after a collaborative year of building community alliances with the Archie Gibbons family, with Archie, Roxanne, Phoebe, and a Patrons Council of local Black business and civic leaders, we renamed and rededicated it as the Archie Gibbons Senior Collection of African American Literature and Life. As your program notes summarize, much of my energy as founding faculty scholar and ex officio volunteer curator over the coming years focused on making the Gibbons collection a vital campus and community resource. Exhibitions, teacher training seminars, community outreach, reprint book series of classic African American novels and memoirs, award-winning writers series and workshops, traveling jazz and poetry ensemble called the Langston Hughes project that had us traipsing around the country, band of musicians like trying to herd cats. Twin Cities Public Television documentaries interpreted by Dan Bergen and his crew. All these things were in process. To lighten that load, in 1997, Bob didn't remember the year precisely, I was rescued from curatorial responsibilities when, through the welcome support of President Brunick's, a regular curatorship finally came into being, which, as he also mentioned, is materialized here tonight as its current incarnation in the multi-talented persona of one-time Gibbons Collection graduate research assistant, Davu Serwin. Right? Since rewiring in 2019, a term I prefer to retiring, 5 years ago, I found little reason to surrender or regret those things I remain most passionate about. But I have gained more compass for reflection and rememory, to return to Toni Morrison's coinage. One of the cautionary gleanings that I've learned from more than 4 professorial decades inside the classroom and out is that in the ever morphing, ever surprising interchange with students of younger generations, which you throw up into the air, as Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man still warns, may come back to whack you as boomerang. In that vein, one of the assignments I regularly gave to students taking my survey courses on African American literary history and culture was hopefully designed to help them get inside the ancestral legacies and creative processes behind both contemporary popular culture and high culture expression, and to seek their own personal connections. So I've routinely given them a choice between doing a close textual and contextual analysis of their favorite commercial song lyric, or alternatively, of composing their own original lyric according to the poetic and musical and social conventions of whatever genre most engages them. On one particular occasion, and I'm heading in for the close, an otherwise quiet but attentive student during class, who shall remain nameless, came to me after class during office hours and announced, "Professor Wright, I'm trying to choose between doing an analysis of my favorite Tupac Shakur rap, he's my man, and writing my own original gangster rap song." To which I blithely replied, "So what's the problem?" "Well," he said, "after being in class with you and hearing some of your stories and checking out some of the rumblings I've heard on the grapevine about your doings on and off campus, I've decided that if I choose the second option, I'm going to do you up gangster rap style. And I want to know if that's going to be a problem."
I love it.
Startled somewhat, but nonetheless intrigued by the prospect, I countered, "What would it mean to do me up gangster rap style?" "Well," he said, "if you know about Tupac and Biggie Smalls, he's the notorious B.I.G. Well, you would be the notorious JSW in Iraq." Too astonished to object, I gave him my conflicted blessing and sent him on his way. For better or for worse, Bridget Marin and Dean Waltner, and all of you here, that assignment option was never submitted. It exists now only in my memory as a bodacious counterpoint to this outstanding achievement award. An award which, in accord with my non-accidental ancestral legacies and my enduring hopes of the future that we all share and struggle over on this university campus, amid our precarious, ongoing national experiment with democracy. I therefore most heartily and humbly accept it.
Oh.